Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and welcome to today's live. Today we have a very special guest joining us, Leo Zagami, author, researcher, and commentator, whose work has focused extensively on the Illuminati, secret societies, the Vatican, Freemasonry, global power structures, geopolitics, religion, and the forces he believes operate behind the scenes of international affairs. Leo has written extensively on these subjects, including his well known work, Confessions of an Illuminati. And I would expect all of you to go and get a copy of his work because it is phenomenal. And he has developed a controversial and highly distinctive perspective on the relationship between religious institutions, political power, financial systems, intelligence networks, and secret societies. Today, we are going to explore some of those claims and, importantly, give Leo the opportunity to explain in his own words. Among the subjects we'll be discussing are his connection with the Vatican's relationship with secret societies, the Illuminati, global banking and monetary policy, Zionism and the Vatican, Jeffrey Epstein and the network surrounding his trafficking operation, China and the Vatican, the future of Christianity and Islam, and his theory of a potential one world religion, what he calls Chrislam. So, welcome, Mr. Leo, to the live. I'm happy that you're here, and I'm sure you have a lot to share with our audience today.
Well, I'm eager to hear your line of questioning. You seem to be very prepared. So here we go, Andrea. It's a pleasure to meet you and your audience.
Thank you so much. Now, you have spoken, Leo, extensively about the Vatican and its internal structures. What is your personal connection to the Vatican, and how did you acquire the information that forms the basis of your claims about its operations?
Well, I was born at the Gemelli Hospital, which is regarded as the Pope's hospital. So I was almost born inside the Vatican in Rome. I grew up also in Rome, and that means being very much in contact with the Vatican, especially since my mother started to collaborate with the Vatican media and introduced me to the Vatican media, which were the first place where I started my career, first as a DJ, then also as a journalist, and of course, a media personality. So there was this connection from a very early age. My mother is Catholic, though she's English. She comes from an aristocratic background. She's actually related to what used to be the late Queen Mother. And so that makes me also directly connected to the present King Charles. So there was this, and there is this connection, this family connection, let's say. And then on my father's side, of course, I had my grandfather who was a senator for the monarchic party earlier on, then for their social democrats, and he was also a Freemason. And within my family, I have a long line of Freemasons on both sides of my family. So this, in a nutshell, is what brought me from a very early age to get interested not only with the politics and the power as such, but with what the elite is really interested in, which is at times also magic, esoteric sciences, and so on, and mystery schools of old are all part of that background. My father was also a psychiatrist, a young psychiatrist, and that also was an interesting influence as that's also with the study of the paranormal in his research. So I think that I have described a little bit my background for you.
Yes. Now, you also have written extensively about the Illuminati and other secret societies. What
Yes.
specifically is the relationship you believe exists between the Vatican and the modern Illuminati? Are we talking about historical connections or contemporary connections or both?
I would say both. Actually, my own personal experience, because here you see, I deal with my own personal experience within the Illuminati, which started in 1993 when a family friend, Prince Aliata di Montereale, got me initiated in the Illuminati of the New World Order and his faction of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, which, by the way, has a big background in the Caribbean. So there is actually a direct link there. And then I went on, like I said, I worked as very much in the media, worked as a DJ, as a record producer, and also as a journalist. But all this in parallel with my interest for the esoteric, for the occult, for a very young age. And of course, the Illuminati have always been, depicted as the big controllers and power movers. In reality, the Illuminati are very much operating under the Vatican still to this day. Now, the modern Illuminati were, let's say, reborn over and over again in the last few decades with various factions. In particular, in 1999, I was myself responsible for co-founding a branch of the Illuminati in the Principality of Monaco. Then a couple of years later, Giuliano Di Bernardo founded the Academy of the Illuminati in Rome, which then branched out to various countries of the former Soviet Union, like Ukraine, but also countries that were previously under the influence of the Soviet Union. Now they are, of course, under NATO, like Romania, and then other countries in the Baltic. You have Estonia, you have Lithuania, you have all those other countries which became also very much on board with this relaunching of the Illuminati, which operated from Switzerland initially in the early 90s as the Dignity Lodge, and then was officially formalized as Academy of the Illuminati in Piazza di Spagna in the early 2000s. So aside from the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt, which historically didn't last that long, because already in the 1780s they suffered the persecution and they had to start changing their own name, because yes, the Illuminati might have existed with the name Order of the Illuminati for a brief time, but then once they started to be noticed, they quickly started to change names and camouflage themselves in a variety of organizations. I mean, you can go from the Skull and Bones to the Bohemian Club to the more recent think tanks that sprang out of the Illuminati, like the Club of Rome, the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberg Club before that, that was very relevant in regards to the European Union and still is a very powerful think tank and organization. But the thing that people often are fascinated is the power that the Illuminati allegedly have. Now, I want to make it clear to all our viewers that in the last 20 years since I started my Confessions of an Illuminati online, and then I started publishing my books, I warned from the very start, from the volume 1 of my Confessions, that there were a number of scams online, of fictitious organizations that claimed to be the Illuminati, mostly Nigerian scams, or scams that simply, are preying on the ignorant, on people that hope to maybe, join an organization and change their lives. It doesn't work in that way. The Illuminati recruit from specific families, from specific businesses. You have to already be either fairly successful or part of a very well-established family to then be recruited within the fold.
Yes. Now, how do you see the relationship between the Vatican, Freemasonry, the Jesuits, the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, and other organizations that are frequently discussed in connection with elite power networks, because that's what we're here to discuss.
Yeah.
Are these
Yes.
genuinely interconnected structures, or are some of these relationships misunderstood?
No, I think that, of course, each one tends to promote their own thing, you know. But in regards to the way this whole hierarchy and this structure is built, I had to imagine. I published 12 volumes. It's like an encyclopedia. It's thousands and thousands of pages. The last volume was published last year. It's volume 12, which
Yes.
represents the
Can you show
Jesuits.
it? Can you show it to the people? Can you show it to the people? Yes, right.
Here,
Uh-huh.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Jesuits are basically what I symbolically see being in charge of the all-seeing eye on top of the pyramid. Then we have also the Sabbatean Frankists, and of course, operating under the Jesuits and the Sabbatean Frankists, then you have all those various organizations, think tanks, and then secret societies, of course, or societies with secrets, because Freemasonry is not really a secret society. Everybody knows about Freemasonry. But yes, this is, for me, very important to stress. The Illuminati can be commonly associated to, historically, Adam Weishaupt, but even at the time of Adam Weishaupt in 1776, they had
Mm-hmm.
a competing organization which was called the Illuminati of Avignon, which
Mm-hmm.
more. So how did they differ, these various branches of the Illuminati? Now, let's say that when Adam Weishaupt came into the fold of the Western initiatic system, he brought his passion for politics, for power, for a secret society that wasn't necessarily dedicated to the esoteric or
Mm-hmm.
inclined to believe in the occult. It was a group of people who really wanted to control and infiltrate Freemasonry, for example, and infiltrate the governments and deal with real power. So that was a different approach suddenly, because
Mm-hmm.
since ancient times, since the mystery schools of ancient times, I'm talking about ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, or all the various mystery schools were built on some belief
Yeah.
in another worldly force. It's a little bit like what happened in the Caribbean, especially in Haiti, because Haiti gained its independence, as we know, with the revolution, which was inspired by voodoo practitioners. But at the same time, we had a lot of Freemasonry that was based in Saint Dominique, and that then gave birth also to this hybridization. And it was for the people, the indigenous people who were there and were trying to rebel. They understood that these secret societies, if they followed their methodology, they could achieve the same success. But unfortunately for them, as we know, they are very much obsessed also with the magical, spiritist side of that, which at that point makes it difficult to have an equilibrium. So, you know, you have enlightenment, rationalism versus superstition. And that is really what we saw in the Caribbean animist practices like Obeah in Jamaica or early voodoo in Saint Dominique. And so it is about understanding that for certain branches of what we commonly refer to as the Illuminati, because, of course, when I presented my series, Confessions of an Illuminati, which is 12 books, I'm not just discussing the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt or the Illuminati of Dom Pernety of Avignon. I'm discussing all these secret societies that somehow are now commonly referred to as the Illuminati, including
Mm-hmm.
at times, also Freemasonry. So we have, in the Caribbean plantocracy, you had all these animist spiritual leaders, such as the Obea men or the voodoo practitioners, who were at the same time the primary drivers of slave resistance and open rebellion. So it was like an element, they perceived the secretive nocturnal rituals of these animist groups and as theological rivals, as direct security threats to the more, let's say, pragmatic and rational forms of Freemasonry. Eventually, we saw, though, how the two things somehow merged because, okay, we had the Haitian Revolution that specifically impacted the Masonic lodges in Saint Dominique. We had the laws that were passed, though, in Jamaica during the 1760s that suppressed officially Obea. So we had the direct intervention also. And then we have the examples of how free, black, and mixed race Caribbean men eventually formed their own forms of Freemasonry and their own lodges in the 1800s in the Caribbean. So it's a fascinating and complex historical convergence that brings us people and figures that are well known also in the Illuminati in the Western world, like Martinez de Pasquali. Martinez de Pasquali lived most of his life in in Saint Dominique, in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. But he was really merging what were intense forms of European occultism that somehow collided with the world of African animism. But in a way, it kind of like brought a cross-fertilization of esoteric ideas together. So you had these elements that came from even the Jewish Sabbatean Frankists that were kind of merging with some elements of animism and so on. And so that's what really brings us this incredible mix that eventually will converge in the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, which
Yes.
people don't know that the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite has a link to the Jesuits and the Vatican, but also a link to the Sabbatean Frankists, as well as a link to Haitian voodoo and this Caribbean melting pot that we had at the time. So you have actually elements of high degree Masonic magic that somehow have elements of this tradition that comes from this enslaved African majority. So it's very interesting anthropologically and culturally.
We are the only ones, or very few ones, who are screaming out the Vatican. The entire media infrastructure is placing a lot of emphasis on Zionism, right? And everybody is calling Israel.
Yes.
And, Max Blumenthal, these brilliant people, journalists in the United States, they're barely even scratching the surface of really who is at the center, who wields the power. Candace and all
well,
these. What do you think of these people?
Well, they're scratching the surface because the moment in which you dig deeper, you might risk your own life. I think Charlie Kirk is the example of all that. I mean, Charlie Kirk had been kind of introduced to the Sabbatean Frankist heresy, which I, by the way, discussed very much in this other book, The Rise and Fall of a Frankist Monster, because Jeffrey Epstein was a Sabbatean Frankist. And Sabbatean Frankist is a sect within Judaism, which has taken control basically of Judaism, and is the one behind the creation of Zionism as we know it and of the State of Israel. So it's very important to understand that it's not the Jewish people that are to be blamed, but the sect that infiltrated Judaism and that infiltrated and then created organizations that preach maybe orthodoxy in a way, like Chabad Lubavitch movement, which sees the involvement of Jared Kushner. But even Trump is involved deeply with the Kabbalah And so that is a big problem, because you see, although President Trump has, declared this affinity with the Jewish people and the state of Israel, but this connection started a long time ago. And this connection goes, apparently, Maria Maples, that was the Trump's second wife, told the Israel Channel 12 News that the president keeps an Aramaic copy of the Book of Pinchas under his clothing, close to his heart, for healing and protection. I mean, that portion of the Book of Numbers, which is specifically Numbers 25, 10, and 31, is distributed usually among Kabbalists. And it is part of that Sabbatean Frankist legacy that the president of the United States sadly has, and it's keeping him hostage in the White House of all the decisions also that are taken, including, unfortunately, the war that now is expanding and is becoming a mega war, because it's not only about Ukraine and Russia, but it's now about the Middle East, Iran, Strait of Hormuz, and it's about really the great reset of our resources. And the way that the Vatican is involved in all this is that the Vatican has been the guiding force behind Davos. I explained that in volume 7 of my Confessions, which is a book which is from the occult roots of the Great Reset, because I explained these occult roots, and I explained how in December 1965 these progressive forces of the Second Vatican Council that have been gathering there for years were closing the council and were gathering in the catacombs in Rome, and that the guy who headed this revolution was the guy who then became the mentor of Klaus Schwab, and was guested in Davos. He was known as the Red Bishop. So I think that people need to understand that the Vatican is very much about power and control rather than simply Holy Marys and all that.
Yes. Now, when we look at the hierarchy, would you say that the Jesuits are the top, and then you have the Zionists and the Opus Dei, and the World Economic Forum? How would you give us a picture of the hierarchical structure in terms of the power that the elites wield in the world?
Well, the power structure on top necessarily has two forces, the banking, the material, the commercial force, which is in the hands of the Sabbatean Frankists, which are, of course, Jewish, but they have also recruited amongst them Christians like Trump, but also like Peter Thiel, for example, is part of their power structure. Even if then at times we see these powers, these oppositions between, inside squabbles that can occur between different factions of the New World Order. On top, ultimately, we have the Sabbatean Frankists and the Jesuits, which kind of sealed this alliance during the Second Vatican Council, which was this historic event that took place in the first half of the 1960s. And that reformed and reorganized the whole Catholic Church. As we know it today, the Catholic Church is but a reflection, a mild, very different church from what we had pre-conciliary, before the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, and before it was announced by Pope John the 23rd. And I explain in my latest book, which is the Vatican Top Secret Alien Agenda, that in reality there is also an extraterrestrial, non-human intelligence, interdimensional, extra-dimensional, whatever you want to call it, that is guiding the Vatican and the Sabbatean Frankists.
Yes. Now, moving from religion to economics, who do you believe ultimately exercises the greatest influence over monetary policy and the international banking system. Is power concentrated in central banks, governments, private financial institutions, supranational rather, organizations, or somewhere beyond all of them? Because people say that the Vatican, for example, is never audited, so nobody knows the enormous amount of money that resides in the Vatican. How do you really explain that?
Okay, the Vatican relies on the banking system, which, like I said a moment ago, is connected to the Sabbatean Frankists. I mean, it was the Warburgs of the situation and other Sabbateans, Frankists, that then founded the Federal Reserve. It was the actual Sabbatean Frankists that created the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. And let's not forget
Mm-hmm.
that Jacob Frank, who was himself the guy who took over after Shabbatai Zevi and created then the Sabbatean Frankists, was based in Frankfurt in the outskirts in Offenbach. And that's really where the control of the money and then later on, of course, of the politics came from. Families like the Rothschild were working with the Vatican for a couple of 100 years. Then we had other people always connected to the Sabbatean Frankists that helped out somehow the Vatican in their quest also for maintaining, because it's not a question only of having gold or having monetary reserves. It's also about maintaining them or maybe investing in certain things. Now, the Vatican is always there criticizing, for example, the weapons, the weapon dealers, but often this money has been accepted in the EOR, which is the Vatican Bank, and also money that was created by drug dealing, even in South America, eventually ended up in the Vatican Bank together with the money of the mafia. I mean, it's not like the Vatican doesn't like to launder money,
Mm-hmm.
just like any other financial institution.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is important to realize that their ethics and morals go out of the window when it comes down to that.
Yes. It's just that people, the world in which we live, I think people have accepted that banks are necessary. They think that the financial institutions that stand above them are things that are really natural. But when you look at the history of it, you understand that the Vatican is behind the Knights Templars, for example, behind the financial system of the world.
Well, let's not forget that, for example, like I explained in Volume 7 of my Confessions, Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, which is a typical follower of the green leftist ideal, but I mean, it's typical. It's also connected to Pier Giorgio Bassi, who is the vice president of the Academy of the Illuminati, in the project which has been called Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism with the Vatican. I mean, it's an actual organization that was shaped in recent times, that sees the involvement of both a member of the Rothschild family as well as a high-level member of the Illuminati like Pier Giorgio Bassi, which, by the way, I also included in my latest book, because here he is next to the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal
Yes.
Parolin, and
Mm-hmm.
Bassi is also now in charge of disclosure, because of the disclosure regarding UAP and non-human intelligence, because apparently the Vatican has an enormous interest towards this topic.
Mhm. Now, Epstein and the networks of power. We know that we were consumed with information about Jeffrey Epstein and his child trafficking and sacrifice. Now, Jeffrey Epstein's crimes and his connections to prominent individuals have generated enormous public interest. Do you believe Epstein's trafficking operation was simply a criminal enterprise, or was it connected to a broader intelligence, political, financial, or elite network? What evidence do you believe supports your position?
Well, I published this book before, of course, we had the release of Bust chunks, not all of them, of course, of the so-called Epstein files. And they all confirmed what I wrote in my book, all the connections regarding his connections with the Rothschild, with other families. They are connections that go back hundreds of years, because it's not about Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein himself is a member of the Epstein family, which made an immense fortune at the end of the 18th century in the textile industry with this way of coloring clothes, and then invested in what used to be the first private bank in Poland, and then later on became involved with the central bank of the Austro-Hungaric Empire. So we're talking about a guy who came from a background that then welcomed him once he decided to join the Trilateral Commission. So it's always about the same group of people that controls politics and money. Let's not forget that. And also prints the money, because who prints the money, of course, has the power.
I've always thought that the Vatican is very, very cunning. And I think that they use front people and organizations like Jeffrey Epstein and Zionism as a way of covering and hiding behind them in terms of what they do, so that they can assume this moral authority, which they don't really have, but the world is not looking at them, so the world still views them as the moral authority when they are behind most of what we're seeing in the world.
I think you're very much spot on there, because, for example, the Jesuits, until they could, then there was a point until it wasn't possible for them, but they deliberately attacked over and over again and promoted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in their #1 magazine, La Civiltà Cattolica. At the end of the 1800s, they were promoting what then would become the basis for that infamous book, The Protocols of the Sages of Zion. So it was about always blaming the Jews, because on top of that, like I explain in this book, but I also explain in volume 10 of my Confessions, which is dedicated to Islam, the Sabbatean Frankists, when they couldn't convince you to join them, then they would become your worst enemy, even if you were a Jewish person like them. It was the Sabbatean Frankists that were behind the Holocaust. It was the Sabbatean Frankists that were behind the birth of Adolf Hitler himself. In the emails of Jeffrey Epstein, we see Jeffrey Epstein talking with a member of the Rothschild family, talking about all the great things that the Epstein, the Rothschild, did for a young Adolf Hitler. I mean, and that he wasn't recognizing them, being more grateful to them in a way. So there is, for the Sabbatean Frankists, even if they are also in charge of the state of Israel, remember that when in the 1930s they could have actually stopped Adolf Hitler when he became chancellor, they didn't intervene. And the B'nai Brit, which was already at that point the biggest Jewish fraternity in the world, and is built more or less like a Masonic organization, could have blocked the banking system, and then the Nazis would have had no possibility of installing themselves in Germany. Instead, it was they made even a deal, which I discussed in this book.
Yes.
A deal between Zionists and Nazis, which basically either you go to Israel or either you go to a concentration camp. More or less, that is what happened, because then those who didn't accept and didn't want to go to Israel, because people don't realize that the majority of Jews didn't really want to go back to Israel. But they were forced into going back to Israel.
And writers like Avram Manhattan, he said something in his book, The Vatican in World Politics, that there is nothing in this world that happens in geopolitics that the Vatican is not involved. Nothing. That is a bold statement that he made, that I wonder if people read his book, what they would think when they're clamoring on Zionism. And I'm not suggesting now that Zionism is not a tool. It's a tool used by the Vatican, but it is not the central power center that people are claiming that it is. Only if people read and become aware of the power structures in the world. Now, let's look at China and the Vatican, because people often look at China as just a secular state. It has nothing to do with anything that comes from the
Mm.
West, even though we know that the United States propped up China in a massive way. Now, China presents a very different political model from the West, yet the Vatican has maintained a complicated relationship with Beijing. What do you believe is really taking place between the Vatican and the Chinese Communist Party? Is this primarily diplomatic, religious, geopolitical, or part of something much larger? Let me hear what you have.
Back to volume 12, because it's been almost 500 years that the Jesuits have been dealing with China. I mean, they started their actual mission after Ignazio Loyola in 1540 was finally accepted together with his entourage to establish this order for the Catholic Church and to fight, of
Mm-hmm,
course, the Reformation. But their first intention was to go and conquer distant lands and not really bringing them the gospel, but doing something totally different. And in fact, Ricci was the first one with the group. They went to China and they actually became advisors to the emperor. But what they did, they didn't bring them the gospel. They brought them knowledge of astronomy in exchange
mm-hmm,
for their own knowledge. And then they will actually dress up like Chinese Confucius believers. And they even try to convert then the Vatican to accept the Confucius rites as part of Catholicism, which
mm-hmm,
lasted for like 6 popes. This controversy is called the Jesuit Chinese controversy. You can find it on the internet. It's quite fascinating. But then it was the Jesuits that helped China become the superpower it is today. Even if they were briefly persecuted after the arrival of Mao Zedong, when he established contemporary China, communist
mm-hmm,
China, he picked up those Jesuits that will convert to communism full on, and then he will establish the National Catholic Church, the church that is controlled by the state. Then at
mm-hmm,
that point, we see until Pope Francis two realities in China: an underground church, which was the real church that really wanted to believe in the traditionally ordained pope and all the various bishops and cardinals and all that. And then you had these other Catholics were the ones approved by the state that could
mm-hmm,
worship publicly. And then suddenly, in the fall of 2018, as I explain here, things changed because Pope Francis, a Jesuit,
mm-hmm,
made a deal, a formal deal, that was from that point onwards renewed every year, and it's been renewed also with Pope Leo XIV, in which there is no longer an underground church, but there is only one Catholic Church that works in unison with the Chinese Communist Party and their own National Catholic Church. So all those bishops that were illegally and also with an apostolic lineage that is not valid, nominated by the Chinese Communist Party, were suddenly recognized by the Pope.
mm-hmm,
And the Pope, in exchange, received millions of dollars. China started to pour hundreds of millions of dollars with the arrival of Pope Francis. The late Pope Francis was the moment in which China and the Vatican ended their conflict. But in reality, the conflict between the Jesuits and China never existed. In fact, the Chinese
right, right,
revere the Jesuits. To this day, there is a shrine in Beijing to Matteo Ricci, which is considered one of the most eminent and important first early Jesuits that went to China. So I think that it's important to realize that there was a
yes,
moment in the story when we had the beginning, I think, of the pandemic, or even earlier than that. You remember there was a Chinese lady that kind of grabbed the hand of Pope Francis in St. Peter's Square in the evening, and then Pope Francis was like, "Don't bother me," no? But that Chinese lady was from the underground church that no longer could exist because of the deal that was made. So it's almost like the Vatican has made a deal with the devil. Actually, they have made a deal with the devil, because if you make a deal with the Chinese Communist Party, you're making a deal with Satan.
Yes, and people don't understand too that in Cuba that Fidel Castro was Jesuit trained, and
Yes.
that
And the
that he
brother,
had, yeah, and that he
and
had very connection. In fact, the United States cannot do anything to Cuba without the permission of the Vatican in Cuba. People don't realize that. They think that
yeah.
that Cubans are just fighting of their own, but they don't understand that they are tied a lot to the Vatican. Could you just explain to them what happens to Cuba and the Vatican?
Okay, when the revolution took over Cuba, the Freemasons, strangely enough, stayed on the island. Freemasonry has always stayed in the island of Cuba, and they work along with the Santeria Regla de Ocha and Palo Mayombe, all the various Santeria synchronized Yoruba Orisha worship, which happens to be together with the Catholic saints that are used to hide these ancestral practices from the colonizer. So we have, in Cuba, this mix. And I personally met Freemasons from Cuba during my life as a Freemason, especially in Norway. I used to have a friend who was an 18th degree Freemason from Cuba, which teach me a lot about their own practices. And also about the fact that Fidel Castro was a 33 degree Freemason, so was Che Guevara, and so were other protagonists of the revolution. Now, Freemasonry stays there in Cuba and works together with the Jesuits, who, by the way, control, of course, Cuba, even if Cuba formally seems to be an atheist communist country, in reality is very much controlled by the Jesuits. The Jesuits are a little bit like the Hugan of Haiti, the voodoo priest, because they mix religion with science and with controlling people in every way, shape, or form.
Yes, because the same the Haitian president, what's his name again, that was in Haiti during the 1990s, that Jean-Bertrand Aristide is also another Jesuit trained person who
Absolutely.
people regard as being revolutionary, and they don't understand that it's all working in sync with the plans of the Vatican, and nothing, as what Avram Manhattan says, that happens in the world is done without the imprimatur of
Think
the
about
Vatican.
it, no? The history of the Jesuits in the Caribbean is deeply intertwined with the brutal mechanics of the transatlantic slave trade, the colonial economics, and the global political shockwaves of the 18th century. Rather than operating as missionaries, the Jesuits have always operated as power brokers, and in that context, in the colonial Caribbean, they functioned simultaneously as an elite corporate plantation owners and spiritual ministers. In the end, their controversial role triggered their expulsion from the Caribbean. I mean, there was a
Yes,
moment in which they were
yes,
kicked out of the Caribbean, so it's not like they stayed there. So I think that people understood that they were, I mean, the Society of Jesus, as they call themselves, is nothing to do with Jesus. And actually,
it has
they
nothing.
were,
I'm happy because you said again, it's an atheistic organization. They were behind the French Revolution, and many people don't understand that the Society of Jesus has nothing to do with Jesus. It's in an
yes.
atheistic society, but that is what it does. It wears the garb of Christ, but it is Lucifer entirely.
Well, I mean, still to this day on their websites, if you go, they are asking for forgiveness for having operated all the lucrative sugar, indigo, coffee plantations worked by thousands of enslaved Africans. They were involved with the slavery here in the United States of America.
Yes,
I mean, the
yes,
guys were actually very much encouraging and taking
yes,
advantage of slavery.
yes, yes. And I tell you to Leo, during the pandemic, when I did not know much about Fauci, and when I read his biography and I learned that he was Jesuit trained, I said, I
Yeah.
care not to hear about whatever vaccine they're going to use. I just know that that is not for me because I understand that the history of the Jesuits and they are behind a lot of poison. And when I looked and saw his connection, I already knew that not for me. I'm going to be not in that sort of medical situation. But many of our people don't understand. They don't want to understand too. That's another thing. Or people, and I'm sure you are on your platform. You're finding out the same thing. Or people don't want to hear the truth. What they want to
Mm.
hear is they run after the crowd. Whatever the crowd is saying, the chorus is there. This it's a Zionist. It's a Zionist, and they keep on saying that until their minds are brainwashed and they become paralyzed. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to generalize and create, this kind of very superficial conspiracy theories that go and scratch only the surface. Because when you really understand who created Zionism, then you have to go back 500 years to the Puritans, to Oliver Cromwell, and then you have to go and study the history of how the Sabbatean Frankists and Shabbatai Zevi himself was the first one to
Mm-hmm.
call back the Jewish tribes to Israel. So that was really triggered because, like I said, the Jews were scattered all over the world. But when Zionists then, with Theodor Herzl,
Right.
became formally the Congress in Switzerland and gave birth to the basis for which they wanted then to claim the land of Israel. Well, then they found themselves with a very different form of Judaism and of Jews, because the Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazis were very different between each other, and only started to integrate here in America at the end of the 19th century. Because before, the Sephardic Jews, who were the first ones to arrive here in America, and the ones who, by the way, together with the Caribbean input, went and created the Supreme Council of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, were actually very much against welcoming the Ashkenazi Jews. They didn't even let the daughters marry the Ashkenazi Jews. So there was a conflict even within Judaism. There was the ultra-reformed secularized Jew that was also a product of the Sabbatean Frankists, who was seeing this Orthodox talking Yiddish as some kind of tribal, primitive people. I mean, I cite in this book a phrase of Franz Kafka, who, after listening to these people talking Yiddish, he actually compared them to some tribe in Africa, saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this kind of people. So this makes you understand even the inherent anti-racism, let's say, within the actual Jewish people. I mean, it's kind of incredible, no? And after they create the state of Israel, and of course that comes with a lot of compromises that the various factions, they just said, let's just come together so we can finally claim our promised land. But
Yes.
in regards, for example, to the interesting elements from the Caribbean, there was actually, aside from a connection with the very roots of the ancient and accepted the Scottish Rite, also a connection with certain wine merchants and stuff who were Sephardic Jews but were Sabbatean. So there was definitely also a connection there. And eventually, when they created this ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, it then
Mm-hmm.
later on became the leading form of Freemasonry here in the United States of America.
Yes. Now, do you believe China could become an important component of the global system that you've been warning about? And how does the Vatican fit into that emerging relationship between China and the West?
But China, like I said, has almost 500 years of constant relation with the Jesuits. So the Jesuits have been a participant to the first silk trade, as they used to call it, and is participant also to this new silk trade route which China is trying to establish. China is definitely the leading power of this new world order, which is
Mm-hmm.
surfacing together with the robotics and the AI, which
Mm-hmm.
are really the innovation of the future.
Yes.
When you talk about China, you talk about a nation that, by the way, has their own form of Freemasonry, which has nothing to do with Freemasonry in other countries, because it
Mm-hmm.
was actually the Chinese who stole the symbols of Western Freemasonry and used them for their own secret societies that
Mm-hmm.
then also controlled the triads and so on. So there is actually a form of Freemasonry, the Hongmen, which is specific to Taiwan and also to mainland China, where they even have a political party, which is the only party allowed aside from the Communist Party. I think it's called the Xing Party or something like that. People, though, don't know that China is very much present also here in the United States. San Francisco is deemed as one of the mother lodge of Chinese Freemasonry
Mm-hmm.
that led to the creation of modern China. So
Yes.
at one point, when you were in the middle of the pandemic, they cleared up San Francisco, and suddenly Newsom, with all the communist flags going like this in the street, cleaned up San Francisco and received the Xi Jinping like it was the second coming of Christ. I mean, it's just incredible how things are developing, because China is really in control, but at the same time is working hand in hand with the Rothschild that, for example, owned a good chunk of the Bank of China. And people don't know that, but at least 20% of the Bank of China is owned by the Rothschild.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a connection. A friend of mine once told me he went to live in China for a period of time and said, I could only find a joint of marijuana if I asked to my friends in the Mossad. I said, what? I said, yes, the only drugs that are dealt in China are the ones dealt by the Israeli intelligence. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Now, your prediction about Pope Francis, you previously made assertions that Pope Francis would be the last pope. Francis has now
yes.
died, and Pope Leo XIV has succeeded him. Looking back at your prediction, how do you explain what appears to be a direct contradiction?
Well, I actually explained it even before the actual election that the
Mm-hmm.
year before the Pope died in June. So we are talking here about the Pope who died in 2025, but in 2024 there was
Mm-hmm.
a specific study and something that went to influence also the canon law, which is the law within the Vatican and the Catholic Church, that established that no longer we should view the Pope as the continuation of a legacy that was established by St. Peter, and that
Mm-hmm.
there had been some historical handling that wasn't correct. This is
Mm-hmm.
actually quite incredible, because it didn't really then it wasn't publicized worldwide, but if you want I can send you the link. And it's an acknowledgement that basically there was this historian in the early days of the church that made up the superiority of the Bishop of Rome compared to the other bishop. What does this mean? It means that with Pope Francis, that legacy of the Bishop of Rome being superior to everybody else, and so Pontifex Maximus, which was
Mm-hmm.
actually a Roman title of old from the days of their pagan legacy, and not a Christian title, this whole thing ends with Pope Francis. So yes, we have Pope Leo XIV, but Pope Leo XIV is working now under this new frame, which means that he can re-welcome into the church all those lost factions.
Mm-hmm.
Why we have Pope Leo XIV? Because Pope Leo XIV is an Augustinian. And who was the most prominent Augustinian that led the church astray? Martin Luther.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like the Jesuits placed an Augustinian pope there in order to push forward and continue their project, which started already with Pope Francis, of a one world religion and of bringing back all these various Christian denominations in communion with Rome. But to bring them in communion with Rome, the actual office of the Pope had to change. So the Pope now is, hand in hand with the Church of England and King Charles, or hand in hand with the Orthodox or with the Evangelicals, or he's trying to bring, but to do that, like I said, renouncing to the what we always call the papacy. So yes, we can say that in theory, but also in practice, the last pope was Pope Francis, because Pope Leo is a bishop of Rome, and that's the only office he wants to hold.
Yeah, Pope Leo the 14th also is an American pope, or the first American pope. What symbolism do you think that plays in the lineup of this one world global governance and religion that they're moving us into?
What it represents in what sense? Sorry.
Yes, what it represents. What do you think his being pope, the first American pope in the history
It's
of the
not only
Vatican?
the first American pope, and this is very important that I underline this, because Pope Leo has notable Caribbean connections through his maternal Louisiana Creole ancestry, which includes roots that trace back to Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Cuba.
Yes, yes.
And this is very important because we are talking about family members who were practicing not only Catholicism, but practicing also animism and what we know as voodoo. So definitely a pope that is highly unusual, because it comes to us with a white face, but in reality he has also this deep black ancestry, which was in a way prophesied. And we have definitely with Pope Leo somebody who is arriving in a church which obviously is a different church from what we had prior to John Paul II. Prior to John Paul II, it was all Italian popes. Then, from John Paul I was basically murdered by the Freemasons after 33 days in order to bring in, usher in John Paul II, which functioned as a pope, but also as a geopolitical figure, because that was the moment in which we had they were trying to instigate the fall of the Soviet Union and a crack in all its power structure. So money that was filtered through the Vatican Bank to Solidarność and all that. Then after Pope John Paul II, who was a Polish pope, and who, by the way, blessed Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And Jeffrey Epstein apparently spent a lot of time in the Vatican, and this is also something that came out in the various Epstein files, which is also something that has never been cleared. The fact that in the emails by his closest collaborators, they talk about Jeffrey Epstein spending a bunch of time in the Vatican is something that, to my knowledge, nobody is still trying to investigate. But on top of that, we have here the image of a future saint of the Catholic Church, who is actually blessing these two individuals. But then in my book, I explained that John Paul II was very much devoted to the Holy Mary of Czestochowa. And the Holy Mary of Czestochowa was the place where Jacob Frank, of the Sabbatean Frankists, the leader, was arrested and placed for 12 to 13 years there, and then eventually liberated was liberated later by the Russians. But in that time, he devised a belief that included the Holy Mary of Czestochowa in his heretical Jewish structure.
Yes. Yes. Now, so, you've argued that a future one world religion could take the form of Chrislam. That's a merger between Christianity and Islam. And what evidence leads you to believe that Christianity and Islam could eventually be brought together within a broader global religious structure? Now, I must lay the caveat that, you know, when you study Freemasonry, my understanding, I've never been a Freemason, so I just learned by reading that when you are at the lower level, you can be whatever religion you want to be a part of. But when you get to the 33 or the 32nd degree, you see that the Quran is what is on the, to be a master mason, you have to study the Quran. That's my what I've read. I don't know. Could you clarify that?
No, no, I would say that technically that is not totally correct, but I
Hmm.
guess that I will explain you why they say that.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, the actual Freemason goes through 3 degrees, and those 3 degrees are the degrees that bring him to become Master Mason. And up until the degree of Master Mason, the only religious subjects which are used in the allegories and symbolism are from the Old Testament. So they seemingly don't clash with any particular religious belief. However, when you then indulge into a specific rite of
Hmm.
Freemasonry, then the things are different. Like, for example, the York Rite is obviously a Christian rite in essence, though it has some elements that might be a little bit Gnostic and so on, while instead the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite was born as a rite that wanted to be specifically embraced by Christians, but then eventually became more of a universal
Hmm.
rite. And so for that reason, it was reformed, in particular by Albert Pike, who was the great reformer of the rite. So I would say that when you get to the highest degrees, you become a Knights Templar, just like you become a Knights Templar is in other rites of Freemason, including the York Rite or the rectified Scottish Rite or the Swedish Rite or so on. The apex of the Masonic rites is always the Templar degrees, somehow.
Hmm.
But the
Hmm.
way that it was reformed within a structure that, of course, was embracing also Jewish members, they couldn't have it so strictly Christian because it will have, you know, got out so this reform somehow was made in a way so it will make it more universal, more embracing of something that starts to feel like a syncretic religion, a basis for a one world religion that is coming together also nowadays thanks to the Vatican, which, by the way, like I explained in volume 7 of my Confessions, actively participates with the Freemasons in constituting this one world religion, which means, like Pope Francis did, going to make deals with Sunni Islam, then making deals with the Shia Islam, and then making deals with the Buddhists, the Jews, and so and whatnot.
So while you're explaining that and that convergence between Christianity and Islam, what role then do you think the war that we're currently seeing in Iran, what role is that playing? Because people don't understand that there is one war that they see on the television and another war that is going on behind the scenes. Could you explain what's happening behind the scenes for us?
Well, they are choking the world resources, and strategically, this whole great reset started, of course, with Ukraine, with all the fertilizers, the oil and the gas that came out both from Russia and Ukraine that suddenly, you know, was halted, and now we have also this crisis with the Strait of Hormuz and, of course, Iran. Iran represents really the beginning of the oil industry. People don't know that, but I think it was around 1906 that Iran became the first nation on earth to start an
Mm-hmm.
oil industry. So Iran is very important also because it's linked to China, it's linked to Russia, and
Mm-hmm.
we know that the New World Order is no longer going to be headed by the United States of America, which seems to have lost that, you know, pivotal and main role of being in charge of the pyramid, no? Is now shifting towards China. And China and Russia and the Sino-Russian world order is definitely a reality that is manifesting more and more. In regards to Iran, though, there is something that I revealed in volume 10 of my Confessions. The fact that Iran had a lot of gold, and in the last days of the Shah, before the return of what became the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, of course, built up the new Republic of Iran based on the Shia precepts and all that. Before the Khomeini takeover, the gold was actually picked up with the help of the Vatican, that then asked the help of the Italian Sicilian mafia. And they recruited, first, thanks to an Italian American, they recruited a bunch of Sicilian mafiosi. They went to Iran and they picked up all this gold, and then they brought it to the Vatican vaults. Now, Khomeini never addressed this because it would have been seen as a sign of weakness at the beginning of his takeover. And so the Iranian people don't really know the truth regarding the fact that all the Shah and all the Freemasons, because they were all Freemasons of various obediences that were operating at the time, they all emigrated with the Shah and his family outside of Iran. But they also brought away their gold. So the Vatican is kind of like always trying to be very much, not, I mean, they know the truth, that they have obviously robbed somehow the Iranian people. So I don't think they want the Iranian people to know that.
Yes.
And that is, of course, goes also along with the fact that what is happening in the Middle East is also the product of the Sabbatean Frankist agenda of wanting to create a great Israel, of wanting to rediscuss their borders as they did in the past. Let's not forget that it was the Sabbatean Frankists and their lodges that eventually provoked the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And it was because of the fall of the Ottoman Empire that then we have the United Kingdom, the Great Britain coming in and taking over Palestine. And after that, of course, we know what has happened. So it's very sad to see that at the moment the Sabbatean Frankists are also somehow using all the Jewish people who are living there in Israel without really knowing they are pawns in a game.
Yes. Now, who benefits from the one world religion? And what is it that they want from the global people? Do they want the global population to be religious, or do they just want the population to worship them and not necessarily a deity like Allah or, Jehovah?
I think that ultimately the one world religion is simply a way of putting together the religious powers of the world in time for a scientific control of the whole thing, because the AI will inevitably become their god. That is what they want, and what they want to implement. So it's one step at a time. We're going closer to a church which is abandoning their religious values. We saw it during the pandemic. The Pope was celebrating Mass in an empty square in St. Peter's, and then he was, of course, not letting anybody who was not vaccinated inside the Vatican. He was praising the CEO of Pfizer. He was praising, of course, Dr. Fauci a superhero. We're talking about criminals. I mean, the fact that Pope Francis forced the 900 people inside the Vatican to take a vaccine which might
Hmm.
have jeopardized their life. I mean, it's insane. But that
Yes.
shows you that their future God, whatever that they're planning with their one world religion, is not about God. It's about science above God. What they claim is science, of
Yeah,
course.
it was very clear to us. It was very clear to us during the pandemic that it was a religion. And the fact that they were telling us that, we're going to kill somebody if you don't take it, you know that they were appealing to the moral conscience. It was not about the science per se. It was like ethical, it was religious. And people did not really see that. They just thought that it was Anthony Fauci and the US president and the World Economic Forum behind what was happening. But they could
Sure.
not see that the Vatican was a major player in the ordeal.
Well, the Vatican is very clever to hide themselves behind, a lot of Holy Marys, a lot of blessings, a lot of nonsense. But in the end, the Vatican is the biggest controller of them all. Because if we go back in time, there is actually an old speech that Fauci did at Georgetown University in front of a bunch of Jesuits, in which he was already
Mm-hmm.
outlining the future pandemic and the way it would be defined.
Mm-hmm.
So here, so the fact that Dr. Fauci is an untouchable, I believe that whatever they're gonna bring against him, even if, of course, the Republicans like to play now and to make a big show, but like all the shows that have been put together by Donald Trump since he arrived in the White House, there is not really any consistent result, any real result, because he's promising things that never materialize. He promised no wars. He promised to interrupt the existing wars after 24 hours, and we all applauded them. Even myself believed that he could finally stop this military industrial complex and this banking system from taking advantage of us. Instead, he's actually being the guy in charge of the whole takeover here and of the Great Reset. Because by doing what he's doing with Iran, he's facilitating the Great Reset. By
Mm-hmm.
doing what he's doing with China, the tariffs and everything else, he's still facilitating the Great Reset.
Yes, because they're telling, well, the media is controlled by the Vatican and the Jesuits. We know all of that. So the fact that Fauci was, summoned to Congress to answer to questions, it was just a charade, and people don't
A
understand that.
charade like, also these UFO, UAP whistleblowers and the whole thing regarding disclosure, because
Hmm.
these 5 batch of UFO, UAP disclosure are simply lights in the skies or documents without really contextualizing them and without really giving us the right background. Is just more and more distraction, nothing consistent, nothing that confirms the reality that instead is being held by the military industrial complex behind the scenes together with the defense contractors and the CIA, that there exists a legacy program and that there exists a UFO, UAP crash retrieval program which has been used for reverse engineering. And that is something that unfortunately nobody's acknowledging.
Yes. Let's answer some of the questions before you go, because we know that you don't have a long time. So if there is any questions here, let me see if there. Good evening, everyone, and let me see if there is any question. We have Dennis. Let me show here. Dennis Bolanos. Is it
Bolanos, yes,
true?
is an
Oh, yeah, yeah.
old
Is it
friend of
true that
ours.
the thing that grants the Illuminati their incredible power is their money, their politics, and their religion?
I think that what grants them their immense power is, of course, at this materialistic level, their money, their influence within their banking system or politics. But in reality, when you go behind the scenes, they seem to be obsessed with other matters. And that is very interesting because you see, all these people, when they actually are super rich and they can't achieve more than what they have already achieved, then they want something else. They want to achieve immortality. They want
Mm-hmm.
to achieve things that are, very distant from the common folk.
Yes, yes. Somebody's saying distractions. They think that talking about the Vatican are distractions. How would you respond to people who perhaps are not reading and they're not attuned to what is happening in global geopolitics?
Well, no, I think that maybe the person in question that says distractions has acknowledged the fact that a lot of things are, pushed in the global discussion daily, and they are part of these distractions. In reality, what we have discussed today instead is what we have behind the theater, who is really pulling the strings. And in regards to the Jacob Frank mention, I mean, we cannot avoid mentioning a guy who has influenced so much the power structure of today. Because when we go and we see what Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein did, or before them, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, I mean, the Hawk family, because that's the real name, it's a Sabatier Frankis family. The Epstein family is a Sabatier Frankis family. And if you don't want to acknowledge that, well, then you will never be able to understand the real power structure that we have behind all this, which is the Vatican and, of course, the Vatican bankers.
Yes, I think one of the things to Mr. Leo is that many of us who grew up in the English-speaking societies where the Catholic Church was not the dominant church, we don't understand what Roman Catholicism is all about. You know, we see it and we see these guys go to church and they're proclaiming the gospel, but
Mm.
it's not like in Latino countries where you have the Vatican and the Catholic Church really wielding a lot of power over their politics and decide. Like, you're from Italy, so you understand. But so I think that that is why we have this cognitive dissonance in the region, particularly
Yeah.
because they grew up in that English speaking society. So they think, and even America too,
I
Americans don't
think
really
that
understand the role
personally,
of the Vatican.
I personally think that though we don't hear maybe much about it, if we go and study, especially in volume 12, I explain how even here in the United States of America in 1776, when the Jesuits actually had been casted out of the Vatican, there was a very profound influence. Even in the very building that the power structure, the Congress is taking
Hmm.
control of this country,
Hmm.
we have a very important Jesuit legacy.
Hmm.
And people don't know the very
Yeah.
family that donated the place where where we have the Congress and the building, the whole thing was
Yeah.
donated by people
Yeah.
involved with the Jesuits. They were part of the Jesuits. So I mean, I think the problem here is that in the English-speaking country, because the Catholics have always been viewed in America as a minority,
Hmm.
or in Great Britain, same after, of course, the advent of the Church of England and Protestantism, there's always been this kind of, well, the Catholics,
Hmm.
they're not a big deal. But in reality, if we go back and study things, we understand that their symbolism is, and also their power is very much present
Yeah.
in America, in Great Britain, everywhere else in the world, in the Caribbean. I mean, yes, we talked about, for example, the Freemasons. In nations like Cuba, you have roughly 30,000 Freemasons across 316 lodges. In the
Hmm.
Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, we have sovereign grand lodges that are completely independent. We have also.
Have you heard about Miss Mia Motley of Barbados? And she is like the chief advocate of the climate change agenda. Do you know her, and what is she connected with?
Well, I don't have much knowledge, but I know that their jurisdiction that control that part of the world is the District Grand Lodge of Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, which also is interestingly enough is connected to the Scottish Grand Lodge and the Scottish Constitution. So they have this specific link with the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And they have also created a bunch of university lodges, which is rather interesting because it seems like they are eager to recruit people there at a very young age so they can shape them and mold them for their society role. You know, it's like it's focused on mentorship, on civic duty, on leadership for collegiate youth. This doesn't happen in every country in the world. It seems like the Masonic governance across the islands there relies very much, and of course you have also some important event like you have the Cayman half-yearly weekend, which happens also and is connected also to the Irish provincial Grand Master for Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the Cayman Islands. So there is also a link with the Grand Lodge of Ireland. I mean, so there is definitely a very strong presence there, and at the same time you have the Jesuits. And when people see the Jesuits, there is a very big, while in Latin America, the Jesuits are very much connected with Freemasonry, in British-speaking countries, that's not the case. They are viewed as opposite factions or different factions. You will never see a Jesuit in a lodge of Freemasons, for example, in Barbados or in the Eastern Caribbean or in other places. And you will not find that. It's impossible.
They're there, but they're not the prominent, but they're there. Trust me, they're there.
No, they are there, but not visibly, because instead, in South or Central America, you can actually find them in the lodges of Freemasonry. You can actually find them dressed up as Freemasons one day and as Jesuits the day after. So it's more visible, let's say. I'm sure they're there, though. I'm sure they're there. Then let's not forget you.
Yeah, Pepe Dumont is saying that I heard Jacob Frank mentioned about 10 times. I guess he's wondering the emphasis on this person.
Well, we said that it's a very important person because it is also a point of union between this Jewish heresy, the Sabbatean Frankists, and the Catholic Church. Let's not forget that Jacob Frank bought 20,000 converts from Judaism into Catholicism to himself then benefit later on. But one last thing that we should mention is Prince Hall Freemasonry. Because, historically, African-American Prince Hall Grand Lodges have always maintained their jurisdiction across islands like Bahamas, Barbados, so they have a very important role. They are very much linked, on the contrary of what we say regular, but nowadays Prince Hall Freemasonry is pretty much regularized, so there is not anymore this distinction. But the Jesuits tend to link with the Prince Hall Masons more. When Joe Biden finished his presidency, on the last day of his presidency, or the day before, I think, he was actually made a Freemason for the Prince Hall Freemasons here in the United States of America. And Joe Biden was a Jesuit agent and a Catholic president.
Yes.
So this makes you understand the link there.
One last question before you go. I know you have to go now, Mr. Zagami. I have read Whitney Webb's book on the One Nation under Blackmail. She has 2 volumes. I'm not sure if you've read them. Whitney, not Brittany, but Whitney Webb's book.
I had
One Nation under Blackmail. She has 2 volumes in which she has really, given succinct, a clear, understanding of Zionism and the power structures in the United States. But she too has ignored the role of the Vatican. Have you read her books, and what did you think about her work?
Okay, I must be honest. I never read the two-volume book, One Nation Under Blackmail. It's my fault because I should read it. Unfortunately, I have so many books to read and so many books to write, which makes it very difficult for me. But I must read it sooner or later because they told me it's an excellent book. However, there is, she. Uh, explores the ties, as I heard, between the Israeli intelligence agencies, the organized crime, the operations
Mm-hmm.
of Jeffrey Epstein, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But without touching the Jesuits, without touching the Sabbatean Frankists, without touching, I think, this kind of knowledge, because this kind of knowledge is knowledge that is not really known by mainstream historians or journalists. It's knowledge that you have to be more acquainted maybe with the study of the esoteric secret societies and realities that are a little bit more difficult to detect and
How can you
understand if
how can
you
you study? Yeah, how can you study organized crime and not connect it to the Vatican? It's something almost very difficult to do.
well, I mean, they should only watch Godfather Part 3 to get it. I mean, that's it. We can only tell them to watch the Godfather Part 3. Watch it. I mean, because if you don't mention I mean, it's a link which is very tight. I mean, when Roberto Calvi was found on the Blackfriars Bridge in London, that was a very important moment for Freemasonry worldwide. It created a massive wave of a crisis that still to this day, Freemasonry is not all made of criminals. It's also made of
Mhm.
good people. We have to
Mhm.
be honest about it, because
Yes.
otherwise people think that, but unfortunately, because of the secrecy that is practiced within the lodges, organized crime and also
Mhm.
sectarian activities from various sects that have been recruiting within Freemasonry or think tanks or so on. They took advantage basically of the
Mhm.
secrecy that is practiced in the lodges. And I have always been very critical. When I joined myself Freemasonry in the United Grand Lodge of England, I remember that in the 90s, certain Grand Lodges of Prince Hall had been regularized. Thank God there wasn't any more that racism that was characterizing the earlier years and so on. But I also understood that they had changed the ritual of the enter apprentice degree because they started to understand that, when you ask an individual to not betray your organization, otherwise you will have to slit your throat or tear yourself apart and all that. It became a problem for them, and so they had to actually make a specific note that that was all symbolic, you know.
Mhm.
But other Masonic organizations didn't do that, and they keep that belief that if you betray the organization, you will have that kind of ending. So I know that today we are in a different world. I don't think that, but in some cases, there is Masonic organizations which might combine the criminal world with the Vatican. And those were the organizations I had to flee when I left Italy in 2019, because I had
Mhm.
exposed them in my books.
Yes.
Those organizations are not maybe the regular Freemasons that you find at the entrance of every town in America with their, with the address of the local lodge and all that, who is it's a little bit like joining the Rotary Club. I'm talking a bit here about lodges of Freemasons which are built as a cover up for criminal organizations. And unfortunately, they exist also here in America. I discovered in the last few years that here in America, the first victims of criminal Masonic organizations are actually Black African Americans, because Prince Hall Freemasons, which didn't accept to join the regularity when they were regularized, when the United Grand Lodge of England in the 1990s started to give the recognition, all that, because of their nature, they went underground and they started to create organizations which are very criminal in the way they operate. Just see, for example, what happened with the doctor of Michael Jackson. who was nominated Grand Medical Officer by one of these illegitimate and irregular Masonic obediences. I talked about it in volume 8 of my Confessions.
Okay,
So,
thank you. So, go ahead.
So I think that it's very important to understand that there is, of
Yes.
course, people who are honest, who maybe go to a lodge because they want to learn about the ancient mysteries, schools of old, they want to simply learn about things or maybe practice rituals in the context of a very respectable organization. And then there is people who unfortunately have brought disrepute to this respectable organization. And I think it is actually for Freemasons the first thing to denounce those criminal activities taking place in their lodges, wherever they are and whatever kind of masonry they are.
Thank you so much for joining our program, Mr. Leo Zagami. And
Thank you.
Hopefully that one of these days again we'll invite you. I apologize that we didn't have hundreds of people watching because of your intellect and your thorough expertise on this subject. But I'm sure that they'll like it and they'll share it with their colleagues and their friends and their family members. Thank you so much. And now we understand that the dictum "all roads lead to Rome" was not just crafted for just nothing. It was just not empty words. It's very real that all roads do lead to Rome. So get your answer together, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see. Go ahead, Mr. Zagami.
Yeah, for those people who have been following us today, go to leozagami.com for my latest articles and, of course, the links to my latest books.
I have all of that in the description because I'll let them know your website, your books on Amazon that they need to go and purchase. So all of that information will be put in the description upon publication of this video.
Thank you so much. God bless you all and God bless your audience.
And I look forward to seeing you another time.
Absolutely. Likewise.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Okay, so we want to thank Mr. Zagami for joining us this evening. Thought, as I was telling him, that there would have been more of you on the program because of the importance of this subject, right? We are not going to hear this from the mainstream media. They won't tell it. In fact, the mainstream media is controlled by the same power structure. Yes, I will do that, Stephen. The same. Let me see if I can get all your comments before we go. So we have exactly, yes, we're saying now we have to now look at what is distractions. We have a lot of distractions in the world, but we have to zero in on what are not only distractions, but things that we have to focus on. Not everything is a distraction. Some things are things that we have to focus our eyes on and make sure that we get an understanding of the real powers, right? But even though they are behind a lot of the distractions, but we can't laugh at everything because eventually our world is going to turn into a dictatorship and there's nothing to laugh about. Pedro DeMont is saying they already come out in the open to recruit. They do. They're no longer hiding, by the way. Yes, I'll post his books in the description. Trevor, very good. Thank you so much for joining as usual, Trevor. And then Diotima is saying, where can we access your work, Leo? Yes, I'm leaving that in the description. It is www.leo.com. All of that will be placed in the description. I have everything ready upon publication. Thank you so much, Marie Singh, for a very insightful presentation. It was, and he was a very good guest. Stephen, thank you. Great show. Yeah, so we can end here for today. I think we're all tired, and it was very intense. So I don't think we need to linger any longer. So make sure that you share it, like the live before you end it, and get to share the live so we can get it out to many people. Glad to hear the acknowledgement of the lodges going after the youth, especially here in the Caribbean at the universities. We need to keep an eye on them. Absolutely. And people, be careful. I'm not saying that all we're doing here is sensitizing you to what is happening. You make your decision whether you want to join a lodge. That is up to you. But we're presenting here the facts, the realities, and people are free to make their choice. Just as if you want to take a vaccine, we are giving you the facts, and then you can do whatever you want to do with your life. It's your life, so you make the decision in terms of where you go with it, what you do with it, your life, and what decisions are best for you. But I can tell you that Freemasonry is not one of the best decisions in terms of getting a job and getting connection with people. Yeah, it is. But, are you going to sell your soul? That is something that you have to think about. But in terms of the monetary reward, yes, that might be something that's attractive and connection to powerful people. Pedro Jamotti saying, glad to hear someone mention the Frankist. Yes, I heard him on Sean Atwood's program. By the way, why is it that, Black people on the whole, we don't like to hear these things? When you have white audiences, they would be clamoring for what he's saying, because what he's saying has a lot of sense. He's making a lot of sense and connecting a lot of the dots, but as people, Black people, we claim that we are the most exploited, yet we don't want to understand who is behind some of the exploitation of our people. So we have sponsored Leo Zagami, The Vatican's Top Secret Alien Agenda, Hidden Encounters. Right, these are the books, and I'll be leaving them in the description as well. Thank you so much, Marie, for bringing that. I have everything, all of that in the description. So when you check the video, you'll see all of those put. And you can also check his name on Amazon, where you will see all the books that he has written. And I'll send to you the website where you can also go. And his YouTube channel, he has also a YouTube channel, so you can also go and subscribe and interact with his work. Right. One of the things I like about him, he's not a basher. He's not bashing anybody and telling, like some of us on podcasters, we like to behave like we are the know-it-all and all of that. He's not doing that. Notice that he's not saying that. He's only saying this is what they could do a little bit more and so forth. I like his humility. And that's why I invited him on the program. Some of us just don't want to keep our heads buried under the sand. You're correct. And it is sad. Now, Trevor is saying, yes, I remember him from Sean's channel, but it was really refreshing to hear his knowledge of the Caribbean connection. When I came on, I didn't see him in the guest room, and I was like, he's not coming. But he came prepared, right? He came prepared to answer us, and he understood that we were largely a Caribbean audience. Leo Zagami's book on Amazon, The Vatican's Top Secret Alien Agenda, he speaks about that, guys, the UFOs and the alien agenda, hidden encounters, forbidden rituals, and Jesuit astronomers in the age of UFO disclosure. Thank you so much, Marie, let me have it on the screen for a while, and you can, if you guys want to copy it or you want to screenshot it, but you screenshot it so that you can go if you don't want to go back to the video. And we have, so you can screenshot Marie's comment there and write the books. All the books are listed there, or most of the books. Okay, so let's go now to Diotima. It's really obvious that the current power structure is exploiting society. Yeah, why we're doing this is the fact that, yes, we know, all of us on this program, we know that there's a power structure. We know that there is an elite group that is running the country, the world rather. But the fact is, many people are still aware of the power center. Right, we're still putting it in Zionism, and Zionism is a powerful force. We're not here saying that Zionism is not a powerful structure and force. It is. However, it does not stop there. They have their higher bosses that they're doing the whatever for. They're running and doing their errands for. So we have to be aware of that. Trump is not the end all, and he also has to follow instructions coming to him from the Zionists, and the Zionists from the Jesuits and all of these people up there. Now, because it shows Blacks connected also. Yeah, Black people are connected, but as a people, we who are the ordinary people who are not connected to power, we should understand who really stands at the highest power centers of the world, right? And we should understand that the Vatican has been around for over 2,000 years, and it never died. Its political power did wane, but its religious power has always been prominent. And you go to Latin America, go to Brazil, go to Colombia, go to Latin America, much of Europe, Italy, and you will understand that the Vatican reigns supreme. That Rome never collapsed. That's it, never collapsed. The pagan Roman Empire fell, but when it came now to the Roman Catholic church, it took over from the pagan Roman Empire, and since then it has wielded a lot of influence over on the world. The only country that it has is China was one, but now we are hearing the Vatican, the Jesuit connection to China. For years they could not really gain access to China, but through Western American connection to China, we're seeing now that the Vatican is getting a lot of making connections with China, as it were, and also with Russia too. Then we have the Roman Empire transformed. Very well said. The Roman Empire transformed. Okay, what it wants now is to regain its political power that it lost during the French Revolution, which it has not been able to get back yet, but it's on the road now to getting that sort of power that it once held over the world. Remember now, before, nobody could question Rome. If you question her, that's why she was called the Iron Power, then you would face the consequences, right? So that is what, and Rome says that her spiritual power stands above her political power. So whenever she gains access to all the world, then she's going to wield her religion, whatever that is. Now, Rome is not a religious center per se, no. They will accommodate for any religion once you are following their dictats. So you don't have to be Roman Catholic. When they say one world religion, it doesn't mean that you're going to be Roman Catholic. It just means that you are going to follow everything they say. So if there's a vaccine, you have to take it. If surveillance, you have to be surveilled. All of that stuff, right? Because Rome can be anything it wants to be. It can be Islam, it can be Christian, it can be Hindu, anything. That is how Rome plays its games. So you've got to be very careful. Rome is cunning, right? Rome is a cunning power, right? And it has not lost it. In fact, it has mastered the art of being a cunning global power. All right, so any questions? We'll talk tomorrow again, and have a great evening. And please like the live and share it with as many people. It was a very good conversation. I'm pleased with the fact that you came, you showed up. Those of you who normally come, we hope that there was more. Yeah, is there an earthquake in Trinidad? In Trinidad, you can't question, right? You can't question. By the way, Trinidad is also very Catholic to a great degree too, right? Trinidad, I forgot that Trinidad is really Catholic more than perhaps Protestant. Like Barbados and Jamaica, I think that Trinidad, which is a Spanish name, is more so Catholic. Is there an earthquake? Yes, yes, we have Marie saying in Trinidad you can't question the Catholic Church. You get instant enemies. It's amazing. Yes, because Trinidad has the Catholic Church wields a lot of power over Trinidad. I forgot that to have asked him a little more to comment on Trinidad. I think he did say something about Trinidad during the conversation. Yeah, is there an earthquake in Trinidad, or was there one of 5.1 they said on the Richter scale in Trinidad? And how was that, Marie? Can you tell us what was happening there? Did you feel it? The earthquake that was, I think, was yesterday, 5.1. I'm reading on the Richter scale, or was it another country? I think it was Trinidad. And Pedro is saying that you mean they subdue her power to draw sheep? Yes. Yeah. So I hope that the earthquake in Trinidad was not terrible. Thank you, Andrew. This was a really interesting interview. I enjoyed it immensely. Me too. And I'm the interviewer, and I really enjoyed it. We hope that one of the things I was hoping is that we would have had lots of people. I would tell you we can't answer your questions today. Send me the questions, and then would have a question and answer session with him only, right? So if you are desirous, we can have a future program, but we need to have more people on it though, with a question and answer, whatever questions you have. I won't be asking my questions. You'll send them to my email, and then I'll present those questions to him. Okay, yeah. Yes, there was an earthquake, Marie. I saw it. I read it, and it was 5.1. Hopefully there was not much damage in Trinidad yesterday. Okay, guys, thank you so much. We will talk tomorrow. I'm thinking we should look at Iran, tomorrow, something of the sort. You can send me email or whatever you want to send me by what you want to discuss for tomorrow's program, okay? Thank you so much for joining. We'll talk. Bye. Bye-bye.